The moment the door opened, I knew something was wrong. It was not a sound. It was not a smell. It was the way the new student walked into the room, too smooth, too even, like every step had been measured before his boot ever touched the floor. 23 other students did not notice. Why would they? To them, he was just another transfer, another face added to a classroom that already held 6 different species from 6 different star systems. But I noticed. I always noticed things like that. It was the one gift my old life had given me, and I had spent 3 years at Halewick Academy trying to forget where that gift came from. My name is Owen Marsh, and I was the only human in a school built for the children of ambassadors, generals, and corporate rulers from across the galaxy. I did not belong there by birth. I belonged there because my mother had signed a treaty on behalf of a planet that most of the galaxy still called primitive, and the price of that treaty was 1 human seat in the most exclusive school in known space. I was not a prince. I was not the heir to anything. I was simply proof that humanity existed, sitting quietly in the back row so nobody would remember I was there. That morning started like every other morning. The classroom sat inside a tower of pale stone that curved upward like a wave frozen in place, with windows that looked out over 3 moons instead of 1 sky. My seat was near the window, chosen on my first day because nobody else wanted to sit next to the human. Over time, that had changed a little, not because they respected me, but because they got used to me, the way you get used to a piece of furniture. Professor Illyra stood at the front of the room, her 4 eyes scanning attendance data that floated in the air in front of her. She was Valoon, a species known across the galaxy for patience and precision, and she taught history the way most people teach religion, with total conviction that every lesson mattered. She had just started explaining the political tension building between the outer colonies and the Central Council when the door slid open and the new student walked in. He introduced himself as Cade Ferris, a transfer from a colony world called Wren Station. He had a human name, a human face, and a human voice, and for one strange second I felt something close to relief, thinking maybe I would not be alone anymore. That relief did not last. He moved like he was counting exits. I have seen that walk before. Not in this classroom, not on this planet, but somewhere deep in memory, in a place I tried very hard not to visit. It is the walk of someone who has been trained to enter a room and immediately understand every way out of it. Most people scan a room with their eyes. This student scanned it with his whole body, shoulders angled just enough to keep every corner in view, without ever looking directly at any of them. He sat 2 rows ahead of me, beside Talia Bren, a girl from a mining colony who talked more than anyone else in class and asked more questions than the professor could answer. Beside her sat Nadia Voss, the daughter of a diplomat whose name showed up in galactic news broadcasts more often than most planets. Nadia rarely spoke. She rarely needed to. Her presence alone carried weight, the kind of weight that made even professors choose their words with care. I told myself I was imagining things. 3 years of being the only human in a school built for the powerful had taught me to read tension into everything, because tension was the only language I had ever really understood before I came here. My father had been a soldier before the peace treaties, back when Earth still fought wars nobody outside our solar system cared about. My mother had been a negotiator who ended those wars with words instead of weapons. I grew up between the 2 of them, learning to notice danger the way other children learned to ride a bicycle, and learning to speak calmly the way other children learned nursery rhymes. I had not used any of that in years. I told myself I never would again. Class continued. Professor Illyra spoke about an uprising 3 systems away, where a group calling themselves the Ashfall Movement had begun targeting political families they believed were controlling galactic trade unfairly. She said the words carefully, the way teachers speak about difficult topics when they know young ears are listening but do not want to frighten them. Ashfall had claimed responsibility for several disappearances over the past year. Officials called them extremists. The council called them terrorists. Nobody in that classroom called them a threat sitting 2 rows away, because nobody else had noticed what I had noticed. I glanced at Cade again. He was writing notes, or pretending to, his stylus moving across a translucent screen with practiced ease. But his eyes were not on the screen. They kept drifting toward Nadia, quick and light, like a hunter checking that prey has not moved. I told myself I was wrong. I wanted to be wrong. Being right would mean my quiet life at this school, the one place I had built where nobody expected anything from me, was about to end. At the break between lessons, Talia leaned over to introduce herself properly to Cade, her voice bright, with the kind of curiosity that made her impossible to dislike. She asked him what Ren Station was like, what subjects he enjoyed, whether he had ever been to the central systems before. He answered every question with warmth and ease, laughing at the right moments, tilting his head at the right angle to seem interested. It was a perfect performance. Almost perfect. He answered too fast. Real people pause. They search for words, especially when talking about their own lives, their own memories. Cade answered every question about Ren Station instantly, like he was reading from a file rather than remembering a childhood. When Talia asked what his favorite food from home was, he paused for exactly 1 second too long before naming a dish that, as far as I knew, was common on at least a dozen different colony worlds, generic enough to be safe no matter who was listening. I caught his eyes for just a moment, and for that moment, something in his expression flickered. It was small, it was fast, but I saw it, the same way a person who has grown up around fire can tell the difference between a candle and the start of something larger. He was reading me too. He had noticed that I noticed. Then he smiled, warm and easy, and looked away. The rest of the day passed in ordinary fashion, or at least it appeared to. We moved between lessons in languages, in interspecies law, in a mathematics course taught by an instructor who communicated in pulses of light that our translators converted into numbers. I barely absorbed any of it. My mind kept circling back to that walk, that pause, that flicker in his eyes. At lunch, I sat where I always sat, at the edge of the courtyard under an artificial sky designed to mimic gentle Earth-like weather, a small comfort the school had added for me during my first year, back when the administration still worried I might not adjust. Around me, groups of students from different worlds gathered in their usual clusters, laughing, arguing, trading food from home planets I had never seen. I watched Nadia sit with her small circle of friends near the fountain, unaware that someone might be watching her too, someone far more dangerous than a curious human boy at the edge of the courtyard. Cade sat near enough to see her, far enough not to seem obvious. He was good, very good. If I had not spent years training my eyes to notice exactly this kind of behavior, I would never have picked him out of the crowd. I thought about telling Professor Elira. I thought about telling the school's security office, run by a retired peacekeeper named Dorian Vask, who patrolled the halls more out of habit than necessity. But what would I say? That a new student answered questions too quickly, that he sat with good posture. Nobody would believe me, and worse, everybody would remember that the quiet human boy in the back row suddenly had opinions about danger, and opinions about danger from someone like me always led to questions about my past that I did not want to answer. So I did what I always did. I stayed quiet. I watched. I waited. That evening, back in my room in the residence tower, I sat by the window and looked out over the school grounds, glowing under 3 moons instead of 1. I thought about my parents, about the letters they still sent every few weeks, full of gentle questions about my classes and gentle reminders that I did not have to prove anything to anyone. I thought about the years before this school, the years I rarely spoke about, when my father would wake me before sunrise to run drills in the yard behind our house, not because he wanted a soldier for a son, but because he wanted a son who could survive a galaxy that had not yet decided humanity deserved a seat at the table. I had buried that boy under 3 years of quiet mornings and unremarkable grades. I liked being unremarkable. It was safe. Nobody targets unremarkable. But as I lay awake that night, staring at a ceiling painted with the soft light of distant moons, I could not shake the feeling that somewhere in this school, someone dangerous had just walked in wearing a human face, and that whatever happened next was not going to care whether I wanted to stay unremarkable or not. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, my body remembered how to stay alert even in sleep. Morning would come soon enough, and when it did, I had a feeling the quiet life I had built for myself was about to end. The days that followed moved with a strange, uneven rhythm, like a heartbeat that had learned to skip. On the surface, nothing changed. Classes continued. Talia kept asking questions faster than anyone could answer them, and Cade Ferris settled into the school with the ease of someone who had done this 100 times before. He learned everyone's name within a week. He remembered small details, like the fact that Nadia disliked the taste of processed nutrient paste and preferred real fruit from the greenhouse level, or that Talia's little brother had just started his first year at a colony school 3 systems away. He collected these details the way a merchant collects coins, quietly, patiently, never spending them until the moment was right. I kept watching him, even when I told myself to stop. Every time I decided I had imagined the danger, some small detail would prove me wrong again. Once, during a fire drill that turned out to be nothing more than a faulty sensor in the east wing, every student filed out in confusion and mild panic, except Cade, who was already moving toward the nearest exit before the alarm had even finished its first cycle. He caught himself a moment later and slowed down, blending back into the crowd, but I saw it. I saw the half-second where his training showed through the mask. I began keeping a private log, nothing formal, just short notes typed into a personal device late at night when I could not sleep. I wrote down every strange detail, every inconsistency, every moment his performance slipped. I told myself I was building evidence, something I could eventually bring to Professor Ilira or to the security office, something solid enough that nobody could dismiss it as the nervous imagination of the one human student who had always felt like an outsider. But evidence built from instinct is a hard thing to prove to people who have never needed instinct to survive. Nadia Voss remained his focus. I noticed the pattern now, clear as daylight once I knew what to look for. He never approached her directly. He built connections around her instead, becoming friendly with Talia, who was already close to Nadia, positioning himself at the edges of her daily routine without ever appearing to seek her out. He learned her schedule. He learned which paths she walked between classes, which hours she spent in the upper library reading old political archives, which evenings her personal guard, a broad Kesh warrior named Torin, took a short break to eat in the staff hall instead of standing outside her door. I realized, with a cold and sudden clarity, that Cade was not simply dangerous. He was patient, and patience, in someone with his kind of training, was far more frightening than any burst of open aggression could ever be. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after his arrival, I finally worked up the courage to speak with Dorian Vask, the school's head of security. His office sat at the base of the administration tower, a small room cluttered with old star charts and communication equipment that looked older than most of the students at the school. Dorian had the kind of face that had seen enough real danger to no longer be impressed by student gossip, and I knew that going in. I told him what I had noticed: the walk, the timing, the fire drill, the way Cade had built a web of friendships that all led, eventually, back to Nadia. Dorian listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, and when I finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied me for a long moment before speaking. He told me, not unkindly, that Ren Station colonists often carried themselves differently because of the low-gravity environment they grew up in, which could easily explain unusual posture and movement. He told me that new students often answered questions quickly out of nervousness, trying to seem confident in an unfamiliar place. He told me that becoming friendly with someone as important as Nadia Voss was not unusual at a school full of students hoping to build connections that could shape their entire futures. Every explanation he offered was reasonable, every explanation made sense, and every explanation missed the truth, because Dorian Vask had never met someone trained the way I had once been trained, and could not recognize what I recognized. I left his office with nothing solved and a growing, uncomfortable certainty that if I wanted to protect anyone, I would have to do it myself, without help, without proof, and without anyone believing me until it was already too late. That night, I did something I had not done in 3 years. I opened the old storage case beneath my bed, the one I had never fully unpacked since arriving at the academy, and looked through the few items my father had insisted I bring with me. A small multi-tool, a compact medical kit built for field emergencies, a worn photograph of my parents standing outside our house on Earth, taken before either of them had ever imagined their son would attend school among the children of galactic power. I did not take anything out. I simply looked at them, reminding myself of where I came from and what I had been taught to do when the people around me could not see the danger standing right in front of them. The following week brought the Founders Gathering, an annual event held in the Academy's Grand Hall to celebrate the founding of the school and the alliance between species that made it possible. Every student was required to attend, dressed in formal robes provided by the Academy, standing among ambassadors, generals, and dignitaries from a dozen different worlds. Security for the event was tighter than usual, with peacekeepers stationed at every entrance and identification scanners built into the doorways. Yet none of it seemed to concern Cade in the slightest. If anything, he seemed more relaxed than I had ever seen him, moving through the crowd with an ease that made my skin prickle with warning. I watched him work the room the way I imagined a predator studies a herd, calm, unhurried, confident that nothing in the room could sense what he truly was. He spoke briefly with several important guests, laughed at jokes told by strangers, and accepted a drink from a passing server without ever once losing track of Nadia's position across the hall. I positioned myself near a pillar close enough to watch without drawing attention, my heart beating faster than it had in years. Talia found me there, cheerful as always, teasing me for standing alone at the edge of the party instead of joining the dancing near the center of the hall. I forced a smile and made an excuse about not knowing the steps to whatever traditional dance the Velen students had begun performing near the fountain. She laughed, accepted the excuse, and wandered off to find Nadia, unaware that she was walking closer to danger with every step. Nadia's guard, Torin, stood near the main entrance rather than close to her, following strict formal event protocols that placed guards at doorways instead of directly beside their charges, a tradition meant to project trust and openness during diplomatic gatherings. It was also, I realized with growing dread, exactly the kind of gap someone like Cade would have studied and prepared for. I moved through the crowd, trying to keep both Nadia and Cade in view at the same time, weaving between guests who spoke languages I did not understand and wore clothing from worlds I had never visited. The hall glittered with soft golden light, and somewhere near the far wall, an orchestra of alien musicians played music that shifted between melodies too beautiful and strange for human ears to fully process. Then I saw Cade begin to move. It was subtle, the kind of movement most people would never notice, a slow drift through the crowd that appeared casual but carried clear direction and purpose. He was heading toward the private balcony at the edge of the hall, the same balcony where, I now remembered from earlier conversation, Nadia liked to step outside for quiet moments away from the noise and attention of large gatherings. My chest tightened. I looked around for Dorian Vask, for Torin, for anyone in a position of authority who might listen to me now, but the hall was too crowded, too loud, too full of important people speaking with important people to notice a human student trying to warn them about danger they could not see. I made a decision in that moment that would change everything that followed. I stopped trying to convince anyone else, and I started moving toward the balcony myself. I slipped through the crowd, apologizing quietly to guests I bumped into, ignoring the surprised looks from students who had never seen me move with any real urgency before. My hands felt cold despite the warmth of the hall. My heartbeat filled my ears, steady and controlled, the same rhythm my father had once taught me to breathe into during long nights of training I had spent years trying to forget. I reached the entrance to the balcony just as Nadia stepped through it, alone, seeking a few quiet moments away from the noise, unaware that she was walking directly into the path of someone who had spent weeks preparing for exactly this opportunity. Cade was already there. He stood near the railing, his back partially turned, positioned perfectly between Nadia and the only way back into the hall. From a distance, it looked like nothing more than two students sharing a quiet conversation under the light of 3 moons. Up close, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the stillness in his hands, the careful positioning of his feet that told me everything I needed to know. I stepped onto the balcony, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest, and called out his name. He turned toward me, and for the first time since he had walked into our classroom, I saw his mask slip completely away. What replaced it was cold, focused, and utterly without warmth, the true face of someone who had never once come to this school to learn anything at all. I had found what I was looking for. I only hoped I had not found it too late. For one long second, none of us moved. Nadia stood frozen between us, sensing that something had shifted in the air, but not yet understanding what. The music from the hall drifted faintly through the open doorway, soft and strange, completely at odds with the tension building on that balcony. Cade's expression settled into something calm and almost curious, as if he were recalculating a plan that had suddenly become more complicated than expected. He glanced at me, then at Nadia, then back at me again, and I watched him make a decision in the space of a heartbeat. He moved toward Nadia. I did not think. I did not plan. Years of quiet mornings and forgotten training disappeared in an instant, replaced by something older and more familiar, something my body remembered even when my mind had tried to forget it. I stepped between them, putting myself in the space he needed to cross, and for the first time since he had walked into our classroom, Cade Ferris looked genuinely surprised. He recovered quickly. His hand shot toward my shoulder, not to strike, but to move me aside the way a professional clears an obstacle, expecting me to stumble and fall the way any ordinary student would. I did not stumble. I shifted my weight the way my father had drilled into me 1,000 times as a child, redirecting the force of his push instead of resisting it, and used the motion to pull him slightly off balance. It was not much. It would not have impressed anyone who had actually seen real training before. But it was enough to make him pause, enough to make him look at me with something other than dismissal for the first time. Nadia stumbled backward toward the railing, finally understanding that something was very wrong, and called out for help, in a voice that cracked with sudden fear. Her cry disappeared into the noise of the hall behind us, swallowed by music and laughter and the low hum of hundreds of conversations, and I realized with a sinking feeling that no one inside was going to hear her in time. Cade's calm expression hardened. Whatever plan he had built over the past 2 weeks was falling apart, and I understood, watching his eyes, that he had 2 choices left. He could try to finish what he came for, or he could disappear before anyone else arrived. For a moment, I thought he might choose to run. He did not run. Instead, he turned his full attention toward me, and something in his posture changed completely, shedding the last remaining traces of the friendly transfer student everyone had come to know. What stood in front of me now was something else entirely, trained, focused, and no longer interested in pretending to be anything other than what he truly was. He believed I was the obstacle standing between him and his target, and in his mind, obstacles were meant to be removed quickly and efficiently. What he did not understand, what none of them understood, was that he had made a mistake the moment he decided the quiet human boy in the back row was someone he could dismiss without a second thought. He came at me fast, faster than I expected, even after everything I had noticed about him over the past 2 weeks. I moved backward, giving myself space, letting his first attempt pass just short of its target, the way my father had taught me during years of early morning drills I once resented, and now silently thanked him for. My mind fell into a strange, focused calm, the same calm I remembered from childhood exercises, a place where fear existed but did not control anything. Nadia screamed again, louder this time, and somewhere behind me I heard the first sounds of alarm beginning to spread through the hall, as guests near the balcony doorway noticed the commotion. Cade knew his window was closing. He abandoned caution entirely, moving with a speed and precision that confirmed everything I had suspected about his training, Every instinct I had tried to convince myself was simply paranoia born from years of feeling like an outsider. This was not a student. This was a weapon wearing a student's face, and for 2 weeks, he had walked among us completely unnoticed by everyone except the one person the entire galaxy assumed was too weak and too unremarkable to matter. I blocked his next attempt using my forearm, absorbing the impact the way I had been taught, feeling the shock travel up through my shoulder in a way that would leave a mark I would feel for days afterward. I did not have his training. I did not have years of professional preparation behind me. What I had was a childhood spent learning to survive in a galaxy that had never promised humanity any safety, and a stubborn refusal to let someone hurt a classmate while I stood by and watched. The balcony was small, which worked in my favor. Cade needed space to use his full range of movement, and I kept closing the distance between us instead, forcing him into shorter, less controlled exchanges where his advantages meant less. It was not skill that gave me this idea. It was memory, the memory of my father explaining, years ago, that when facing someone stronger and better trained, distance always favors the stronger opponent, and the only way to level the field is to take that distance away. He grabbed my arm and twisted, and pain shot through my shoulder in a sharp, blinding wave that nearly buckled my knees. I forced myself to stay upright, using the motion of the twist instead of fighting against it, turning my body with the pressure rather than away from it, and drove my elbow backward into his ribs with everything I had left. He grunted, the first sound of real discomfort I had heard from him since he arrived at the academy, and released my arm just long enough for me to put distance between us again. Behind me, the doorway to the hall filled with shapes and shouting voices. Torin, Nadia's guard, finally arrived, moving with the terrifying speed of a trained Kesh warrior, his large frame filling the balcony entrance as he took in the scene in a single sweeping glance. Professor Alira appeared moments later, her 4 eyes wide with alarm, followed quickly by several other staff members, and Dorian Vask himself, finally arriving far too late to have prevented any of what had already happened. Cade understood, in that instant, that his opportunity had fully closed. He turned toward me one final time, and for a brief moment, something almost like respect flickered across his face, quickly replaced by cold calculation. He was already planning his next move, already searching for the fastest way out of a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his control. He lunged toward the balcony railing instead of toward either of us, clearly intending to escape rather than fight his way through a room now filling with security and staff. I understood, in that split second, that if he escaped, everything I had noticed over the past 2 weeks would mean nothing. He would disappear into the galaxy, resurface somewhere else under a different name, and someone else, somewhere else, would eventually pay the price for my failure to stop him here. I moved without thinking, closing the distance between us one final time, and caught the edge of his jacket just as he swung his leg over the railing. He turned, startled by the resistance, and for one dangerous moment we were both balanced at the edge, the lights of the academy grounds glittering far below us under the soft light of 3 moons. Torin reached us first, his powerful arms closing around Cade before either of us went any further, hauling him back over the railing with a force that left no doubt about the strength hiding beneath the Kesh warrior's calm exterior. Cade struggled for only a moment before realizing the fight was truly over, his body going still with the practiced discipline of someone who understood, even in defeat, that continued resistance served no purpose. The balcony filled quickly after that, security personnel moving Nadia to safety, staff members shouting instructions in half a dozen languages, and Professor Ilira kneeling beside me with genuine concern in her 4 wide eyes, asking if I was injured in a voice far gentler than I had ever heard from her before. I sat down slowly, my shoulder throbbing, my hands trembling now that the danger had passed, and my body finally allowed itself to feel everything it had been holding back. Nadia knelt beside me a moment later, her earlier fear replaced by something between shock and gratitude, and thanked me in a quiet voice that carried more sincerity than any formal speech could have offered. Dorian Vask stood over the restrained figure of Cade Ferris, studying him with an expression that mixed disbelief with something close to professional embarrassment, finally understanding that the quiet warnings he had dismissed only days earlier had been correct all along. I looked around at the scene, at the guests now gathering near the doorway with wide eyes and quiet whispers, at Nadia sitting beside me still catching her breath, at Cade being led away in restraints by security personnel who now treated him with the wary respect his true nature deserved. Somewhere in the crowd, I caught sight of Talia's face, pale with shock, staring at me like she had never truly seen me before. Maybe she had not. Maybe none of them had, until tonight. Professor Illyra helped me to my feet, her hand steady on my uninjured shoulder, and asked quietly how I had known, how I had noticed danger that trained security personnel and experienced diplomats had missed entirely. I did not have a simple answer for her, not one I was ready to share in front of a hall full of curious onlookers. The truth was complicated, buried in years of early mornings and forgotten training, in a childhood spent preparing for a galaxy that had never promised my family safety, in the quiet strength my parents had built into me long before I ever understood why it mattered. For 3 years, I had tried to be unremarkable, hiding a part of myself I believed the galaxy would never respect or understand. Standing on that balcony, my shoulder aching and my hands still trembling, I finally understood that being unremarkable had never really been the goal. Surviving had always been the goal, and tonight, for the first time since arriving at this school, I had stopped hiding what surviving actually required. Cade Ferris had walked into our classroom 2 weeks earlier, confident that no one in a school full of powerful families and important futures would ever notice him until it was far too late. He had simply picked the wrong classroom to walk into, and the wrong human to underestimate. The hours after the founders' gathering blurred together in a haze of medical scans, quiet questioning, and the strange, hollow exhaustion that follows any moment of real danger. The Academy's medical wing kept me overnight, not because my injuries were serious, but because Professor Illyra insisted on caution, and nobody argued with her when her 4 eyes narrowed with that particular kind of stubbornness. Dorian Vask visited my room close to midnight, looking older and more tired than I had ever seen him. He sat in the chair beside my bed without saying anything for a long moment, turning a small data device over in his hands as if searching for the right way to begin. He told me that Cade Ferris was not his real name, and that the identity had been built with impressive skill, complete with false records, false family history, and false academic transcripts that had passed every verification check the Academy used for new students. Whoever had prepared him had access to resources far beyond what an ordinary extremist group should have possessed, which meant someone with real influence had been protecting this operation from the very beginning. Dorian admitted, in a voice heavy with something close to shame, that he should have listened to me sooner. He said it plainly, without excuses, and I found that I respected him more for the honesty than I would have if he had simply apologized and moved on. He asked me, carefully, how I had known, and this time, sitting in a quiet medical room, with no crowd watching, I finally gave him something close to the truth. I told him about my father, a soldier from a time before Earth had fully joined galactic society, back when humanity fought its own wars without any help from species who now called us primitive. I told him about early mornings spent running drills in a small yard behind our house, not because my father wanted a warrior for a son, but because he understood, long before anyone else did, that the galaxy would eventually test humanity, and he refused to let his son face that test unprepared. Dorian listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he nodded slowly, the way people nod when a puzzle finally makes sense. He told me that Cade had said very little since his capture, but that security teams working with galactic intelligence officers had already begun tracing the false identity backward, searching for the people who built it and the reasons behind the attempt on Nadia's life. The following days brought change to the Academy in ways I had never expected. News of the attack spread quickly, first through whispered conversations between students, then through official statements released by the school administration, and finally through galactic broadcasts that reached far beyond the walls of our small tower among the stars. HFY movement's connection to the attack was confirmed within a week. Their intended target, not simply Nadia herself, but the political influence her family held over trade negotiations that HFY believed were harming outer colony worlds. Cade, whose real name turned out to be Ren Solari, a name pulled from records nearly a decade old, had been trained since childhood for exactly this kind of operation, moved between colonies and conflicts long before he ever set foot in our classroom. Investigators found evidence linking him to at least 3 other disappearances across different systems, each one following the same pattern of patient infiltration before sudden, decisive action. He had chosen our academy specifically because of its reputation for openness and trust between species, believing that a school built on diplomacy would never expect violence within its own walls. He had studied Nadia's habits for months before ever arriving, learning her schedule, her guards' routines, and the exact layout of the balcony, where he planned to finish his assignment quietly, away from witnesses, in the middle of a celebration meant to honor unity between worlds. What he had not studied, what nobody had thought to warn him about, was the quiet human student sitting near the back of the classroom, the one everyone assumed was simply present because of a treaty rather than because he belonged there. News of what happened spread through the student body in ways that changed how people looked at me almost overnight. Where once I had been invisible, blending into backgrounds and avoiding attention, I now found myself the subject of constant whispers and curious glances wherever I walked. Some of it made me deeply uncomfortable. I had spent 3 years building a quiet life specifically to avoid this kind of attention, and having it thrust upon me all at once felt like losing something I had worked hard to protect. Talia approached me during a free period a few days later, her usual bright energy replaced by something more careful and thoughtful. She apologized, unprompted, for never truly seeing me as anything more than the quiet human in the back row, admitting that she had never once imagined I carried the kind of strength that had saved Nadia's life. I told her there was nothing to apologize for. I had built that quiet image deliberately, and it had worked exactly as intended, right up until the moment it needed to stop working. Nadia sought me out as well, finding me alone in the courtyard beneath the artificial sky designed to remind me of home. She sat beside me without asking permission, something she had never done before, and thanked me again, more formally this time, explaining that her family intended to extend a personal gesture of gratitude once the investigation concluded. I told her that was not necessary, that I had simply done what felt right in the moment, and she studied me for a long time before speaking again. She told me that most people at this school had grown up believing humanity earned its place through treaties and politics, rather than through any real strength or value of its own. She admitted, quietly, that she had believed the same thing, right up until the moment I stepped between her and a trained operative without a single moment of hesitation. She said that watching me fight to protect her had changed something in how she understood humans entirely, and I found myself unsure how to respond to something so honest. Professor Ilira requested a private meeting with me later that week, her office lined with old texts and artifacts collected from a dozen different worlds during her long teaching career. She asked me detailed questions about my training, my upbringing, and my understanding of the political tensions building across galactic space. I answered as honestly as I could, and by the end of our conversation, she made it clear that she intended to recommend additional security awareness training across the entire academy, using what happened as a lesson in recognizing danger that hides behind familiar faces. She also told me something I had not expected to hear from her. She said that humanity's recent arrival into galactic society had led many species, herself included at times, to underestimate what humans were truly capable of, assuming that a species without advanced technology or long history among the stars must therefore be weak in every other way as well. She admitted that assumption had nearly cost Nadia her life, and that the Academy, and perhaps the wider galaxy, owed humanity a more careful and respectful assessment going forward. Dorian Vask's investigation eventually uncovered something even more concerning than a single assassination attempt. Ashfall Movement, it turned out, had identified several other students across different academies throughout galactic space as potential targets, each one connected to families whose political influence threatened the movement's goals. The attempt on Nadia had been intended as the first of several coordinated operations, each one designed to weaken trust between powerful families and destabilize ongoing trade negotiations across multiple systems. Because the attempt had failed, and failed publicly, the entire operation had been forced into hiding, its other planned attacks delayed indefinitely, while galactic intelligence agencies worked to trace every connection back to its source. Dorian told me, with something close to genuine gratitude in his voice, that my actions on that balcony had likely prevented several other attacks from ever taking place, disrupting a network that had operated undetected for years before Cade Ferris ever walked into our classroom. I did not feel like a hero when he told me that. I felt tired, and a little overwhelmed, and uncertain about what my life at this academy would look like now that the quiet anonymity I had relied on for 3 years was permanently gone. But beneath that uncertainty, I also felt something I had not expected to feel, a quiet sense of pride in the training my parents had given me, training I had once resented as a child and had spent years trying to forget once I arrived at a school full of people who seemed so much stronger and more advanced than anything Earth had ever produced. My father called that evening, his voice carrying the same calm steadiness I remembered from every early morning drill in our backyard. He had already heard what happened, news of the attack having reached even the distant corners of Earth's communication networks. He did not ask if I was proud of myself. He did not tell me how impressed he was. He simply asked if I was safe, and when I told him I was, he told me he loved me and that he always knew I would be ready when the moment came, even if neither of us had ever wanted that moment to arrive. My mother spoke next, her voice quieter, more careful, the voice of someone who had spent her career trying to prevent exactly the kind of violence her son had just survived. She told me she was proud of the choice I made to protect someone else, but she also told me, gently, that surviving danger and carrying the weight of it afterward were 2 very different challenges, and that I should allow myself time to process everything that had happened rather than rushing back into ordinary life as if nothing had changed. I sat with her words long after the call ended, staring out my window at the same 3 moons that had witnessed everything that happened on that balcony. For 3 years, I had wanted nothing more than to be unremarkable, to blend quietly into a school built for the powerful and the important. That version of my life was gone now, and as strange as it felt, I found that I did not entirely mourn its passing. I had spent 3 years hiding a part of myself out of fear that the galaxy would never respect what humanity truly was. Standing in the aftermath of everything that happened, I finally understood that respect was never something we needed to hide ourselves to earn. It was something we earned by standing firm exactly when it mattered most, even when nobody expected us to stand at all. 3 weeks after the Founders' Gathering, the Academy held a formal assembly in the Grand Hall, the same room where everything had nearly gone so terribly wrong. This time, the space was filled not with music and celebration, but with quiet, careful attention as the headmaster, a tall and dignified Velen elder named Cassian Doro, addressed the entire student body about the changes the school intended to make in light of recent events. Security protocols were being rewritten from the ground up. Verification systems for new students would now include deeper background checks conducted by galactic intelligence rather than relying solely on submitted records. Guards would remain closer to students of political importance during formal events, regardless of long-standing traditions about trust and openness. And a new course was being introduced for the following term, one focused on recognizing patterns of deception and danger that could hide behind familiar, friendly faces. I sat near the back of the hall during that assembly, in the same kind of seat I had always chosen, though I noticed that fewer people around me treated it as an unwanted seat this time. Talia sat beside me, and Nadia sat just behind us with Torin standing close by, no longer positioned at a formal distance but near enough to respond instantly if anything unexpected occurred again. When the headmaster finished outlining the new security measures, he paused, and the hall grew quieter still. He spoke next about the events on the balcony directly, without exaggeration or dramatic language, simply stating clearly that a student had recognized a threat that trained professionals had missed, and had acted without hesitation to protect a classmate at personal risk to himself. He did not use my name at first, allowing the description to hang in the air for a moment before finally speaking it aloud. I felt every eye in the hall turn toward me at once, and for a moment, old instincts urged me to shrink down into my seat, the way I had for 3 quiet years. I did not shrink. I sat straight, met the headmaster's gaze, and allowed myself, for the first time since arriving at this school, to simply exist in a room without trying to disappear into its edges. The headmaster spoke about humanity next, carefully and thoughtfully, acknowledging that many species across the galaxy, including some within these very walls, had long underestimated what humans were capable of, assuming that a species new to galactic society and lacking advanced technology must also lack the strength, discipline, and courage that older civilizations valued so highly. He admitted that assumption had nearly cost a life, and that the Academy intended to correct it, not simply through new policies, but through a genuine shift in how humanity was regarded among the community of worlds represented within these halls. After the assembly ended, students approached me in ways I had never experienced before. Some simply wanted to shake my hand or offer quiet words of respect. Others asked careful, curious questions about Earth, about my training, about what humanity's history of conflict had actually looked like before we joined the wider galaxy. I answered what I could, careful not to overstate anything, aware that exaggeration would only replace one kind of misunderstanding with another. News of the incident had spread well beyond the Academy by then, carried through galactic broadcasts that reached political circles across dozens of systems. My mother told me, during one of our regular calls, that officials within Earth's own government had begun receiving quiet inquiries from other worlds, some curious, some cautious, all of them reconsidering assumptions about humanity that had gone largely unchallenged since our first contact with galactic society years earlier. She told me that a delegate from a distant system, one that had previously dismissed Earth's requests for expanded trade agreements, had reached out directly following news of what happened at the Academy, requesting a formal meeting to discuss renewed cooperation. She said it carefully, without excessive pride, but I could hear something new in her voice, a quiet satisfaction that years of careful diplomatic work were finally being matched by evidence the wider galaxy could not easily dismiss. Ashfall Movement's operations continued to unravel over the following months, their network exposed piece by piece as galactic intelligence agencies traced connections that Ren Solari's failed mission had accidentally revealed. Several other planned operations were stopped before they could ever begin, and though the movement itself remained active in smaller, quieter ways, its ability to strike without warning had been significantly weakened by everything uncovered in the aftermath of that single balcony encounter. I visited Ren Solari once, near the end of the academic term, before he was transferred to a secure facility for long-term questioning and eventual trial under galactic law. Dorian Vask arranged the meeting reluctantly, unsure whether it would help or harm my own recovery from everything that happened, but I insisted, needing to understand something that had followed me for weeks. He sat calmly behind a reinforced barrier, his expression unreadable in the way I remembered from that final moment on the balcony. I asked him, simply, why he had never considered me a threat, why someone trained as carefully as he clearly was had dismissed the only person in that classroom who might have noticed him for what he truly was. He studied me for a long moment before answering, his voice quiet and without any trace of anger or resentment. He told me that his training had taught him to watch for threats among the powerful, the influential, the people whose deaths would create ripples across galactic politics. He had never been trained to consider that danger might come from someone the galaxy itself had decided did not matter. A quiet human student sitting in the back of a classroom with no political weight behind his name. He told me, almost thoughtfully, that his mistake would likely be studied by others in his line of work for years to come, a lesson about the danger of underestimating anyone, regardless of how unremarkable they appeared on the surface. I left that meeting without any sense of triumph or satisfaction. I left instead with a quiet understanding that the very thing which had once made me feel invisible and unimportant within this school had ultimately become the reason I was able to stop something terrible from happening. Spring arrived at the academy not long after, bringing warmer light through the tower's tall windows and a gentle change in the mood across the entire student body. I found myself walking the halls differently than I once had, not with the careful, quiet steps of someone trying to avoid attention, but with the steady confidence of someone who had finally stopped hiding from a part of himself he once believed the galaxy would never respect. Nadia and I became close friends in the months that followed, an unlikely friendship built from a night neither of us would ever fully forget. Talia remained as bright and curious as ever, though she now asked me questions about Earth's history with a genuine hunger to understand, rather than simple curiosity about an outsider. Even Professor Ilira's classes felt different somehow, her lessons on political history now carrying an added weight whenever she mentioned humanity's recent arrival among the stars. One evening, near the end of the term, I stood alone on that same balcony where everything had changed, looking out over the academy grounds, glowing softly beneath 3 familiar moons. I thought about my parents, about the years of early morning training I had once resented, about the quiet fear that had driven me to hide who I truly was for 3 long years within these walls. I understood now that humanity's place among the stars had never been given to us through treaties or politics alone. It had been earned, quietly and repeatedly, by people willing to stand firm exactly when the galaxy least expected them to, whether on a battlefield, in a negotiation room, or on a small balcony beneath alien moons, protecting someone who had never truly understood how much danger they had walked past every single day. Word of what happened at Halewick Academy spread slowly across galactic news networks in the months that followed, retold and reshaped with each retelling until it became something closer to legend than memory. Other schools across the galaxy began quietly reviewing their own security protocols. Other governments began quietly reconsidering old assumptions about a species they had once dismissed as primitive and unremarkable. Somewhere among the countless conversations sparked by that single night, a phrase began appearing again and again across different systems, spoken half in warning and half in genuine respect among those who now understood a lesson the galaxy had never truly learned before that evening. Never assume a human is unremarkable simply because they choose to stay quiet. I did not choose that path because I wanted recognition or respect from a galaxy that had once looked past me without a second thought. I chose it because someone needed protecting, and because the training my parents gave me, training born from a history of struggle most of the galaxy had never bothered to understand, had prepared me for exactly that moment without either of us ever knowing when it would finally arrive. The assassin had entered our classroom, certain that no one within those walls could possibly stand in his way. He had simply never expected that the wrong human to underestimate would be the one sitting quietly in the back row, watching everything, waiting for the moment the galaxy finally needed him to stop watching and start acting. And when that moment came, I did not hesitate at all.